At 2:15 p.m., after John Ramsey had discovered JonBenet's dead body in the wine cellar down in the basement, his two older children showed up in a taxi out front of his house. Then John Ramsey got in John Fernie's van, Patsy got in somebody else's car, and they all went over to John and Barbara Fernie's house. Sometime in the afternoon, Burke was driven over to John Fernie's house. Now, before I continue on with the events after JonBenet's death, I need to tell you about 3 lawyers. The first is Mike Bynum. Michael Bynum raised his family in the Boulder area while he served as a prosecuting attorney, and then he practiced business law. Mike maintained close ties to his hometown, visiting family and friends frequently and owning a business in Moab, Utah. In 2002, Michael retired from the legal profession and moved back to Moab. John Ramsey was friends with Mike Bynum because they were both investors in Pasta J's restaurant. Grady Brian Morgan was an attorney that worked in a law firm in Denver, and he lived in Boulder, and John Ramsey hired him to represent him in the JonBenet case. Pete Hofstrom was assistant district attorney prosecuting criminals in Boulder, and he also was friends with Mike Bynum and Brian Morgan, and he was sharing information with them. Patsy told Burke that JonBenet had went to heaven. Fleet and Priscilla White left the Fernie's house about 5:45 p.m. That night, JonBenet's doctor and his wife came and visited the Ramseys at the Fernie's house. John Ramsey took a couple of Valium and walked through the house drinking scotch. John Ramsey, John Fernie, and the doctor went out for a short walk outside. Mike Bynum visited John Ramsey sometime after 6 p.m. that night. Pathologist John E. Meyer. The body of this 6-year-old female was first seen by me after I was called to an address identified as 755 15th Street in Boulder. I arrived at the scene approximately at 8 p.m. on 12/26 and entered the house where the decedent's body was located at approximately 8:20 p.m. On December 26, just hours after finding the body, Fleet was surprised to get a call from Mike Bynum, an attorney and Ramsey family friend, who offered to help John and Patsy find appropriate representation. Fleet agreed to meet with John Ramsey's attorneys on the next day in the afternoon. John Ramsey went to the Denver airport to pick up his brother Jeff. They left sometime after 9 p.m. and returned approximately midnight. Detective Linda Arndt came by John Fernie's house to speak to John and Patsy about police interviews. I guess she was told that John Ramsey was in bed sleeping. Second search warrant issued after autopsy for a solid object, the object that might have fractured JonBenet's skull, the source of the dark fibers, and possibly the pineapple. Fleet and Priscilla White were interviewed by the Boulder police in the afternoon. Fleet and Priscilla White were interviewed by Team Ramsey in the late afternoon. Pete Hallstrom called Mike Bynum on Friday afternoon about the body possibly not being released. Detective Arndt and Sergeant Mason stopped by the Fernie's house to have John and Patsy come down to the police station for an interview. Mike Bynum was at the Fernie's house again that night, paying a condolence call, and according to John Ramsey, had arrived with food in hand. Now on this night, when Detective Arndt talked to John Ramsey, he was with his brother Jeff, his financial advisor Rod Westmoreland, Mike Bynum, his lawyer friend, and JonBenet's pediatrician. And Mike Bynum stepped in and said that John and Patsy would not be doing any police interviews tonight or the following day. John Ramsey went to the funeral home to arrange for JonBenet's body to be flown to Atlanta for the funeral. There's conflicting information about the funeral home because John Ramsey writes about Daryl Howe and receiving free services because it was the death of a child in his book, The Death of Innocence. But the mortuary records list Christ, and so does Steve Thomas's book. Sometime in the morning or the afternoon was the infamous discussion when John Ramsey's attorneys confronted Peter Hallstrom in a face-off about releasing JonBenet's body. You can't ransom the body for an interview. Patsy's sister was given permission from the police to go over to the Ramsey's house and pick up a few items for Patsy. Sometime that day, John was overheard to ask someone quietly, "Did you get my golf bag?" On Sunday morning, John and Patsy attended church. This was not the bigger JonBenet memorial service that was held a week later. Arrangements were made for JonBenet's funeral and burial on this day. The last day of the year, 1996, was the day of JonBenet's funeral and the burial service next to her older stepsister, Beth. On the first day of the year, January 1st, 1997, 1 week after Christmas, John and Patsy went on CNN and did an interview about the murder of their daughter, JonBenet Ramsey. Well, this ends this episode of Unsolved, and maybe tomorrow there'll be a special episode on the Jeffrey Epstein case, an introduction. So I'll see you the next time. Bye.